Montreal Canadiens versus Boston Bruins. When you talk about NHL rivalries, you talk about the Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins. This is arguably the most historic and intense rivalry in the NHL, dating all the way back to 1924. It's a clash built on nearly a century of shared history, deep cultural divides, and playoff heartbreak. These two original six franchises have faced off more than any other teams in league history, including a record 35 playoff series. The foundation of this rivalry is rooted not just in hockey, but in identity. Montreal, with its French-Canadian heritage and fast, finesse-driven teams, represented elegance and tradition. Boston, on the other hand, brought a working-class, hard-hitting, no-nonsense brand of hockey that matched the city's tough persona. Their battles in the 1950s and 1970s were mostly one-sided, with the Habs consistently ending Boston's playoff hopes. But the Bruins would eventually claw back and shift the balance in the decades to follow. One of the most infamous moments came in the 1979 semifinals, when Boston took a late lead in Game 7, only to take a too many men on the ice penalty with under 3 minutes left. The Canadiens capitalized with a tying goal and won in overtime, a collapse so brutal it led to Bruins coach Don Cherry's firing. Fast forward to 2004, the two teams met in a heated 7-game series that featured huge hits, wild momentum swings, and post-whistle scrums, highlighting the intense animosity between the rosters. But it was 2011 that reignited the rivalry for a new generation. During a game in March, Zdeno Chara drove Max Pacioretty into the turnbuckle between benches, fracturing his vertebrae and sparking outrage across Montreal. Police got involved, the league launched an investigation, no suspension was handed down, but the moment lived on in infamy. Then, in 2014, when PK Sabin scored an overtime game winner in the playoffs, Bruins fans showered the ice with boos, many of which were unfortunately tied to ugly undertones, further emphasizing the raw emotional stakes of this feud. At its core, Canadiens versus Bruins is not just a rivalry built on proximity or standings. It's built on identity, revenge, and generational trauma. Every chapter of this rivalry is deeply personal, not just to the teams, but to the fans who've grown up learning to hate the other side. It's not just hockey, it's war disguised in skates and sweaters. Colorado Avalanche versus Detroit Red Wings. The rivalry between the Detroit Red Wings and Colorado Avalanche wasn't just violent, it was volcanic. It didn't grow slowly over decades like the Canadiens versus the Bruins. It erupted overnight in 1996 and burned white hot for nearly a decade. The animosity began in Game 6 of the Western Conference Finals, when Avalanche forward Claude Lemieux delivered a brutal blindside hit from behind on Red Wings center Chris Draper, smashing his face into the boards and fracturing his orbital bone and jaw. Lemieux showed little remorse, and Detroit was furious. What followed wasn't just a series of hockey games, it was full-blown warfare. The very next season, on March 26, 1997, came what's now called the Brawl in Hockeytown. It featured multiple fights, including a goalie brawl between Patrick Roy and Mike Vernon, Darren McCarty getting his revenge on Lemieux, and a sold-out Joe Louis Arena roaring in approval. The Red Wings won that game in overtime, but the real victory was emotional. It reset the tone for the rivalry, and from there, things only escalated. Both teams were elite, stacked with future Hall of Famers like Steve Yzerman, Joe Sakic, Peter Forsberg, Brendan Shanahan, Sergei Fedorov, and more. They met in the playoffs 5 times between 1996 and 2002, with each series feeling like a war zone. In 1998, McCarty scored a series-clinching goal that further cemented his villain-turned-hero arc. In 2000 and 2002, Roy and Dominik Hasek traded highlight reel saves and punches in what felt like mythic goalie duels. Each game was an event. Fans tuned in expecting chaos, beauty, and brutality, and got all three. The peak came in 2002, when Detroit and Colorado faced off in the Western Conference Final. It went to a dramatic Game 7, where the Wings demolished the Avs 7-0 on their way to winning the Stanley Cup. for many fans, that game felt like the final blow in a long, bitter battle. After the 2005 NHL lockout and realignment, the rivalry fizzled. Colorado declined, Detroit moved to the Eastern Conference, and the intensity faded. But for a generation of fans, this was the rivalry that defined modern hockey. It wasn't just hatred, it was elite teams fighting at their absolute best, carrying decades of resentment into every shift. It wasn't just the best rivalry of the late 90s. It might be the most entertaining blood feud the NHL has ever seen. Edmonton Oilers versus Calgary Flames. The infamous Battle of Alberta is Canadian hockey's most explosive rivalry, a provincial civil war between the two teams in the Canadian province of Alberta. Fueled by geography, pride, and generations of bad blood, this feud goes far beyond the ice. It started simmering in the early 1980s, when both Alberta teams were loaded with talent and fighting for dominance in the Smythe division. Edmonton, led by Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, and Paul Coffey, was the NHL's high-octane juggernaut. Calgary, with names like Lanny McDonald and Al MacInnis, built a tougher, grittier team determined to dethrone their northern neighbors. What made this rivalry so electric wasn't just the star power. It was that these teams kept running into each other in the playoffs. Between 1983 and 1991, the Oilers and Flames met 5 times in the postseason, with Edmonton winning 4 of those battles and capturing 5 Stanley Cups in that same window. Calgary got its revenge in 1986 when a Steve Smith own goal eliminated the Oilers in a Game 7 heartbreak, and then again in 1989 when they won the Cup themselves. That era defined the rivalry's legacy: speed and skill versus fire and grit, wrapped in pure hatred. After the 1990s, both teams saw a downturn, and the rivalry cooled off until recently. Fueled by a new wave of stars like Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Johnny Gaudreau, and Matthew Tkachuk, the Battle of Alberta was reborn. In 2022, the two sides finally met again in the playoffs for the first time in over 30 years. It was chaos from the start. Game 1 saw 15 goals scored, the highest scoring playoff game between the two. McDavid completely dominated the series, reminding everyone that the rivalry had returned with the intensity of old. The Oilers won the series in 5 games, but every shift felt like a throwback to the 1980s, emotional, unpredictable, and charged with venom. There's something about this rivalry that feels elemental: oil versus fire, finesse versus fury. Every game is a sellout, every hit draws boos or cheers, and every goal feels like it means something more than just a point on the scoreboard. The Battle of Alberta is more than a matchup. It's a cultural event, a symbol of regional pride, and one of the NHL's greatest spectacles. No matter the era, when these two collide, it's personal. Philadelphia Flyers versus Pittsburgh Penguins. The derby between the Philadelphia Flyers and Pittsburgh Penguins is the ultimate fight for control of Pennsylvania. Known as the Keystone State Rivalry, this feud is fueled by geography and attitude. On one side, you have Philadelphia, gritty, blue-collar, and aggressive. On the other hand, Pittsburgh is polished, skill-driven, and confident. The rivalry began in 1967 when both teams entered the NHL as part of the league's first major expansion. But things really took off in the 1970s and 1980s as the Flyers built a reputation as the Broad Street Bullies, punishing teams with physicality and intimidation. The Penguins, meanwhile, were searching for an identity until the arrival of Mario Lemieux, whose presence would help the franchise evolve into a powerhouse. Despite that, the Flyers owned the early years, dominating the Penguins for decades. But the tide began to turn in the 1990s and early 2000s as Pittsburgh found its footing behind Lemieux, Jaromir Jagr, and later, Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. What elevated this rivalry to legendary status were the playoff series. In 2009, the Penguins eliminated the Flyers in 6 games en route to the Stanley Cup. The series was physical, nasty, and emotional, everything a rivalry needs to boil. But it was in 2012 that things hit a fever pitch. The teams met in the first round, and it quickly became one of the wildest, most chaotic playoff series in NHL history. There were line brawls, suspensions, goalie meltdowns, and constant scrums after the whistle. Game 3 alone featured 158 penalty minutes. Claude Giroux became a Philly legend, while Crosby became public enemy number 1 in Philadelphia. The Flyers won the series 4-2, but both teams walked away bruised and bitter. Even in more recent years, with both teams cycling through rebuilds and retools, the intensity hasn't faded. Whether it's a meaningless regular season game or a high-stakes playoff meeting, there's an electricity whenever these two teams share the ice. From fan fights in the stands to war of words in the media, Flyers versus Penguins is never boring. It's a rivalry shaped by decades of hatred, postseason heartbreak, and contrasting hockey philosophies. And while the rosters may change, the emotions never do. In Pennsylvania, you're either orange and black or black and gold. There is no middle ground. Chicago Blackhawks versus Detroit Red Wings. While the Wings' feud with the Avs was personal, emotional, and at times straight up ugly, the rivalry between the Chicago Blackhawks and Detroit Red Wings is one of the oldest and most respected in NHL history. Dating back to 1926, this original six showdown is a clash of Midwest powerhouses, two blue blood franchises separated by just over 280 miles, and a deep, competitive hatred. For decades, they were staples of the same division, facing off dozens of times each season and delivering some of the most iconic moments in regular season and playoff history. The rivalry peaked in intensity during the late 1980s and early 1990s, when both teams were rebuilding into contenders. Chicago had names like Jeremy Roenick, Chris Chelios, and later Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane. Detroit countered with Steve Yzerman, Sergei Fedorov, Nick Lidstrom, and the Russian Five. These weren't just great players, they were future Hall of Famers competing at the highest level, often with division titles or playoff survival on the line. The two teams met 9 times in the playoffs, and each series felt like a war. In 1995, Detroit swept Chicago in the Western Conference Finals on its way to the Stanley Cup Final. In 2009, it was Detroit again who stopped a red-hot Blackhawks team in the Western Final, showcasing their veteran depth and experience. But the most dramatic chapter came in 2013, the last time the two met in the postseason before realignment sent Detroit to the Eastern Conference. The Red Wings took a shocking 3-1 lead in the second round, only for Chicago to storm back, win 3 straight games, and take the series in a dramatic Game 7 overtime. Brent Seabrook's goal not only eliminated Detroit, but it also sent Chicago to a Stanley Cup run that would define their dynasty. Even though realignment in 2013 cooled the frequency of this rivalry, the emotion remains strong. Anytime they meet, whether once a year or in a rare playoff rematch, fans on both sides show up with the same intensity. Detroit's red and white and Chicago's red and black aren't just colors. They're banners of identity, history, and pride. This isn't just an old rivalry for nostalgia's sake. It's a rivalry that helped shape what modern hockey looks like. Physical, skilled, deeply emotional, and rooted in legacy. Blackhawks versus Red Wings is hockey tradition at its most authentic. Montreal Canadiens versus Toronto Maple Leafs. Few rivalries in the sport can match the history, intensity, and cultural weight of the Montreal Canadiens versus Toronto Maple Leafs feud. Dating back to the NHL's earliest days in 1917, this clash isn't just about hockey. It's about pride, language, and the enduring battle between Canada's 2 largest cities. For decades, these teams were the heartbeat of Canadian hockey, particularly during the Original Six era, when they frequently met in the playoffs. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, both clubs traded Stanley Cups and boasted legends like Maurice "Rocket" Richard, Jean Béliveau, and Dave Keon. The rivalry was fueled by regional identity. Montreal, representing French-speaking Quebec, and Toronto, embodying English-speaking Canada. Games often felt like cultural showdowns as much as sporting contests. The 1967 Stanley Cup Final remains iconic, with Toronto defeating Montreal to claim their last championship to date. In the years that followed, fortunes shifted. Montreal dominated the 1970s with dynasties built around Guy Lafleur, while Toronto struggled through ownership missteps and on-ice mediocrity. The rivalry cooled somewhat after NHL expansion and conference realignment reduced playoff meetings. Still, regular season games retained their edge, and fan passion never waned. When the two clubs met in the 2021 Stanley Cup playoffs, their first postseason clash since 1979, the old fire reignited. Toronto led the series 3-1, but suffered a stunning collapse, with Montreal rallying to win in 7 games and eventually reach the Stanley Cup final. Today, the Canadiens-Maple Leafs rivalry remains one of hockey's most beloved fixtures. Every meeting draws packed arenas, national TV coverage, and generations of fans eager to relive history or settle old scores. It's a rivalry where the past is never far from the present, and every goal carries a century's worth of meaning. Maurice Richard versus Gordie Howe. Maurice Rocket. Richard and Gordie Howe were the defining faces of two different hockey cities and cultures in the mid-20th century. Richard, the fiery French-Canadian winger for the Montreal Canadiens, was the symbol of Quebec pride and passion. Howe, the rugged and consistent right winger for the Detroit Red Wings, embodied the hard-working, no-nonsense style of the Canadian prairies. Their rivalry was as much about personality and playing style as it was about team allegiances. Richard played with explosive speed, a deadly shot, and a fiery temper that could ignite crowds and brawls alike. Howe, known as Mr. Hockey, had a more balanced skill set. He could score, defend, and intimidate, often dishing out or taking punishment without losing his composure. The Canadiens and Red Wings frequently battled for supremacy during the 1940s and 1950s, meeting in multiple Stanley Cup finals. When they faced off, the stakes were enormous. Richard's relentless offensive drives clashed with Howe's physical dominance and quiet, unshakable confidence. Fans from Montreal and Detroit didn't just see hockey games. They saw a duel between two of the sport's greatest icons. Off the ice, there was mutual respect, but on it, the competition was ruthless. Richard's temper sometimes got the better of him, while Howe's infamous elbows-up style meant no one left unscathed. The duels between the two weren't just a subplot to the team rivalry, they were the highlight. By the time their careers overlapped for over a decade, they had pushed each other to legendary heights. Richard retired as the NHL's first 500 goal scorer, while Howe continued to dominate for decades. Their rivalry remains a cornerstone of NHL history, a testament to how two great players can define an era through sheer will and competitive fire. Wayne Gretzky versus Mario Lemieux. When you talk about individual rivalries that define eras, Gretzky versus Lemieux stands at the very top. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the NHL had the rare privilege of watching two generational talents push each other to even greater heights. Gretzky, the Great One, was a playmaking wizard with unmatched vision and a staggering list of scoring records. Lemieux, Super Mario, was bigger, stronger, and blessed with an effortless scoring touch that made him a constant threat every time he stepped on the ice. The rivalry wasn't fueled by animosity, but by sheer competitive excellence. Gretzky had already built his dynasty with the Edmonton Oilers by the time Lemieux entered the league in 1984, but the young Penguin quickly made it clear he was there to challenge the throne. The two clashed in all-star games, international tournaments like the 1987 Canada Cup, and the race for scoring titles. While Gretzky was known for his finesse, Lemieux's combination of size and skill made him arguably the most complete offensive force in NHL history. In the late 80s, Lemieux broke Gretzky's streak of 7 straight scoring titles, and by the early 90s, he had led the Penguins to back-to-back Stanley Cups. Their 1987 Canada Cup partnership, where Gretzky set up Lemieux's tournament-winning goal, showed they could be magic together. But when on opposite sides, it was pure competitive theater. The debate over who was truly the best of their era still lingers. Gretzky's career numbers are untouchable, but many argue that if Lemieux had not been plagued by injuries and illness, He could have rewritten the record books himself. This wasn't just a rivalry, it was a golden age for hockey. Sidney Crosby versus Alexander Ovechkin. When Sidney Crosby and Alexander Ovechkin entered the NHL in the mid-2000s, the league was emerging from a lockout and in need of fresh stars to lead a new era. Crosby, drafted first overall in 2005 by the Pittsburgh Penguins, was billed as the next one, a generational playmaker with leadership qualities reminiscent of Wayne Gretzky. Ovechkin, taken first overall in 2004 by the Washington Capitals, was the opposite archetype, a flamboyant, electrifying goal scorer with raw physicality and showmanship. Their rivalry took shape instantly. In their rookie seasons, both dominated the league. Sid the Kid posted 102 points, Ovi 106, winning the Calder Trophy. The NHL seized on their contrasting personalities and playing styles, promoting every Pens versus Caps matchup as must-watch television. These games delivered high-scoring, physical battles with highlight reel goals and fierce competitiveness. The pinnacle of their rivalry came during the 2009 Eastern Conference semifinals, a 7-game epic often called one of the best playoff series of the modern era. Both stars recorded hat tricks in the same game, and the series showcased Ovechkin's pure scoring and Crosby's clutch all-around play. Crosby's Penguins ultimately prevailed and went on to win the Stanley Cup, setting the tone for their postseason head-to-head record, which consistently favored Pittsburgh. Over the years, their careers have reflected different paths to greatness. Crosby became a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, 2009, 2016, 2017, renowned for his two-way game and leadership. The Great Eight, after years of playoff frustration, finally captured the cup in 2018, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest goal scorers in NHL history and chasing Wayne Gretzky's all-time goals record. Though the rivalry has mellowed with age and mutual respect, Crosby versus Ovechkin defined an NHL era. They didn't just compete against each other, they pushed each other to higher levels, revitalized the Penguins-Capitals rivalry, and carried the league's marketing into a new generation. Sean Avery versus Martin Brodeur. Few player-goalie feuds in NHL history were as openly hostile as Sean Avery of the New York Rangers and Martin Brodeur of the New Jersey Devils. This wasn't just on-ice gamesmanship, it was genuine dislike that spilled into media quotes and playoff drama. The tension hit its boiling point during the 2008 Eastern Conference quarterfinals. Avery, known league-wide as the Pest for his relentless trash talk and agitating style, debuted what became infamous as the Avery Rule. Instead of screening Brodeur traditionally, Avery stood facing him, waving his stick in the goalie's face and taunting him verbally, an act so blatant that the NHL implemented an immediate rule banning such behavior mid-series. Their feud was more than one stunt. Avery called Brodeur fatso to reporters, while Marty refused to shake Avery's hand after the Rangers eliminated the Devils in 2008. The bad blood had been simmering for years, fueled by Avery's reputation for targeting star players and Brodeur's pride as one of the game's greatest goaltenders. This wasn't just Rangers versus Devils, it was personal. Avery thrived on chaos and confrontation, while Brodeur, a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, believed in playing with dignity and professionalism. Their clashing personalities created a rivalry that's still remembered as one of the NHL's most colorful sideshows. In the end, Avery's antics couldn't tarnish Brodeur's Hall of Fame career, but they did give hockey one of its most entertaining grudge matches. Ryan Reeves versus Evander Kane. Ryan Reeves versus Evander Kane is one of the NHL's most entertaining and persistent modern player rivalries, fueled by both on-ice physicality and off-ice trash talk. The animosity dates back to Kane's time with the Winnipeg Jets and Reeves' days with the St. Louis Blues, when their teams met frequently in the Central Division. Their clashes intensified in the 2018 Western Conference Final, when Kaner's San Jose Sharks faced Reeves' Vegas Golden Knights. Riavo, known for his heavyweight enforcer role, targeted Kane with big hits and verbal jabs, while Kane openly mocked Reeves' skill level, famously calling him the league's biggest wannabe after a post-whistle scrum. The rivalry thrives because both players embrace the entertainment factor. Reeves is outspoken, using interviews to needle Kane, while Kane fires back with cutting insults and never backs down in scrums. Their chirping often extends to social media, keeping the feud alive even when they aren't in the same division. When Kane joined the Edmonton Oilers, the bad blood reignited in the Pacific Division. Games between Edmonton and teams with Reeves, most recently the Minnesota Wild, feature extra tension whenever they're on the ice together. Even if neither is a top scorer, their confrontations energize fans, teammates, and highlight reels. This rivalry isn't about championships or historical grudges. It's about personality clashes, pride, and the pure spectacle of two of hockey's most combative talkers trying to one-up each other every time they meet. Connor McDavid versus Nathan MacKinnon. In today's NHL, no individual rivalry embodies the battle for hockey supremacy quite like Connor McDavid versus Nathan MacKinnon. While they don't share the same divisional animosity of classic blood feud rivals, their clashes have become marquee events, a contest of speed, skill, and competitive fire that feels like a modern Gretzky versus Lemieux. McDavid, drafted first overall in 2015, quickly became the face of the Edmonton Oilers and arguably the most dynamic offensive player the sport has ever seen. His unmatched acceleration and on-ice vision make him a threat every shift. MacKinnon, the Colorado Avalanche's franchise cornerstone since going first overall in 2013, brings a different but equally devastating package: explosive speed, raw power, and playoff-proven scoring ability. Their rivalry intensified in the 2022 Western Conference Final when Nate the Great's AVs swept McDavid's Oilers en route to a Stanley Cup. It was a statement win for Colorado and a bitter defeat for Edmonton, reinforcing that McDavid's individual brilliance alone couldn't overcome a deep, championship-built roster. Since then, every matchup has carried an undercurrent of unfinished business, with McJesus looking to settle the score and prove that, however great Nate becomes, there's only one Jesus in the NHL. Every matchup between the two carries extra weight, often framed as a measuring stick for who currently holds the unofficial title of best player in the world. Both superstars push each other to new heights. McDavid's consistency in racking up Art Ross trophies and Hart Memorial wins sets the bar, while MacKinnon's blend of leadership and clutch playoff dominance keeps him in the conversation. Their head-to-head games are must-watch events, often featuring end-to-end rushes, highlight reel goals, and a pace few other players can survive at. In an era defined by parity and analytics, McDavid versus MacKinnon delivers something rare, a pure elite-on-elite duel where bragging rights can shift in a single game. It's a rivalry built not on hatred, but on the relentless pursuit of greatness, and every meeting feels like another chapter in the battle for hockey's crown.